Tonight we are joined by Donald Robertson, who in the Stoic community, I'm sure, requires no introduction, but for the benefit of those who are new to Stoicism or have been invited to come along by their Stoic friends, let me just start off by saying a couple of words about him. He is a Scottish Stoic from Ayr. He's a CBT psychotherapist, a best-selling author. You might be familiar with some of his earlier books, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor or Stoicism and the Art of Happiness. He's a founding member of modern Stoicism and a founder of Plato Academy, as well as its director. Those of you who have taken part in Stoic Weeks will also recognize Donald as the author of the original Stoic Week. And those of you whose interest in Stoicism started with psychology will be very familiar with his significant contributions to the field of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. So I just finished reading Donald Robertson's book last weekend, and it's a fascinating book. It feels like you're transported back into the original time. So I'm suspicious whether it wasn't written by a time traveler. So I do encourage all of you to order the book, and I'm sure that if you're interested in Marcus Aurelius, you'll be really excited to read it. And if you're not interested in him, you'll be interested after you finish the book anyway. So we'll start off by an interview with an interview about Marcus Aurelius and Donald's book. And if you have any questions for the Q&A part of the meeting, please just write your questions in the chat. When we think about Marcus Aurelius, we often have this rather idealized and perhaps somewhat a saccharine view of who Marcus Aurelius was, especially since we tend to look at him through the lens of his meditations, which he wrote when he was already an older man. And it's interesting to see what that journey to that wisdom was like. And I'm fascinated by how much we know about the very early life of Marcus Aurelius. We know about him far more than what we know about other philosophers, and even very early childhood before he met Hadrian. So you write in your book that that some of the qualities that were displayed by his family, both his paternal and maternal side, were somewhat at odds with what we would normally expect from the patrician class. So could you perhaps tell us a little bit more about how different his upbringing was and what was this early influence on his life that later shaped his philosophy?
Yep, absolutely. Thanks very much, first of all, for inviting me. I'm looking forward to our conversation. And I think also I'm always particularly happy to be speaking to the Scotland Stoics and some of my fellow countrymen and women. So Marcus Aurelius, we do probably know more about him than any other ancient philosopher, or certainly more than about any other ancient Stoic, that's for sure, because he was a big deal back in his day. We have a lot of different types of evidence about his life, and we do know quite a lot about his early life. And that's partly because as an influential Roman, we know a bit about some of his family and friends, and we can make some inferences about their status in Roman society as well. I think one of the main things we know about Marcus is that his father died when he was probably around about 3 or 4 years old. And frustratingly, that's actually one of the areas where there's quite a big gap in our knowledge, because we don't know why he died or what he died of. But as one of the histories implies, Marcus's father would have been expected, I think, to have become a Roman consul, because other members of his family were. The consul is the highest rank in the Roman Senate. So his father is in this kind of paradoxical position of having been someone who was probably on a pathway to become a very influential, very successful Roman statesman, but died before he had a chance to achieve that. And that sometimes can mislead us because Marcus's other family members were very senior, very powerful figures in the Senate and in Roman politics. His mother didn't remarry. She would have been pretty young, probably, when her husband died, but she was a very kind of matriarchal figure. She was what we would describe, I think, as a wealthy philanthropist and a very educated woman, a woman with family ties to Greek culture, a woman who is most educated Romans would be bilingual in this time, but Marcus's mother was so bilingual, so fluent in Greek as well as in Latin that Marcus Cornelius Fronto, Marcus's tutor, who was quite a pretentious, a kind of Latin sophist, highly educated master of the Latin language. He corresponded with Marcus's mother, and he's ashamed to show her how poor his Greek is and wants Marcus to check the letters first in case he embarrasses himself. Now, that's very interesting because women are often looked down on in Roman society. So Fronto clearly thinks that Marcus's mother he holds her in very high esteem as an intellectual and a highly cultured woman. And she seems to have been surrounded by a kind of intellectual circle or salon of cultured individuals. She also became a kind of mentor or tutor to Fronto's wife, Gratia. So it's reasonable to think that she probably had some role in Marcus's early education. It may be, again, there's some hints that she was quite a particularly independent-minded woman. I'd like to think, we can't be sure about this, but I think it would be reasonable to speculate that she may have had a hand in choosing Marcus's tutors. It's quite plausible. In that case, it raises a very interesting question, which is Marcus has a disproportionate number of Stoic tutors and also has a lot of Greek rhetoric tutors as well. So if that reflects his mother's personality, was she interested in Stoicism herself? Did she want her son in particular to be educated in Greek rhetoric and Greek philosophy? And there's another fragment of this is what it's like being a biographer. Sometimes we have these little tiny teasing clues, but Marcus mentions it very much in passing. A letter that Junius Rusticus wrote to his mother. He doesn't even tell us what it was about. He just says it was in a very plain-spoken style. And that might make us wonder, is it possible that Rusticus was already friends with Marcus's mother before he was appointed as his tutor? There's another very fleeting hint. There's a man that Marcus mentions being a devoted student of Stoicism, just an off-the-cuff passing remark in the Meditations, and he has the same family name as Marcus's mother. So it's possible he was maybe an uncle or some other relative of his mother who was a devoted follower of Stoicism. So it could be on his mother's side there was already some interest or dedication to Stoic philosophy. And Marcus was very close to his mother. So I think we can see her in a sense as being his first mentor or tutor, perhaps, and as a key influence on his later education in Stoicism.
Yes, and when we think about Marcus Aurelius's early search for philosophy, we often think about Stoicism, but it wasn't just Stoicism initially that he was exploring. So there was also some concepts from Cynicism that appealed to him, particularly Parrhesia, about the sort of plain speaking. And then on the other hand, there was Philostoria from Stoicism, this affectionate love that he experienced from his family, which was quite unusual in his class. So how do you see sort of this battle between these two different concepts and whether he reconciled them, and what was it about Stoicism that appealed to him more than Cynicism in the end?
Well, Fronto makes this odd remark. I think he actually says it twice or maybe even 3 times in the letters, he mentions that Marcus's family, and Marcus alludes to this himself in the Meditations, that Marcus's family seem unusual to Fronto because they show more philostorgia, more affection or warmth than he would expect from. He said that this is something that's very rare among nobility or patricians in Roman society. And it might be connected to their interest in Greek culture. Fronto kind of implies that he sees this as more of a bit more of a Greek trait than a Roman trait. So I think that might be part of Marcus's upbringing that's quite important. Sorry, what was the other part of your question?
The other part was
the cynicism. Sorry, the cynicism. Absolutely. Now, we don't know this absolutely for sure. It's not explicitly stated, but Marcus, we're told, got into philosophy when he was 12, which is an unusually, I mean, today, that would seem a little bit surprising. But in Roman society as well, it would be unusual for someone to get into philosophy as deeply as that at that age. Perhaps at 15 or 16 is the age that you would expect Roman boys to begin studying what would be considered an advanced subject like philosophy. And which really only implied, but we're told that the type of philosophy that he was interested in seems to resemble cynicism. And Marcus in the Meditations speaks quite favorably about cynicism. So it kind of wouldn't be surprising. Also, Marcus's big hero, without a doubt, is Epictetus, who almost seems to view himself as a kind of semi-cynic. You know, what he's describing in some ways is a kind of hybrid of Stoicism and cynicism, unlike Seneca. You know, for example, Seneca seems to be describing a different sort of Stoicism that's more distant from the Cynic tradition. So I think it's certainly plausible, and a number of scholars believe that Marcus maybe became interested in cynicism or something resembling cynicism from round about age 12 onwards. Maybe another reason for imagining that is 12 years old, even though Marcus is quite a very intelligent, educated, kind of precocious boy, it's a little bit young to be studying, for example, Stoic logic. Or it's possible, but I think we can say it's more likely Marcus was perhaps more drawn to the philosophical lifestyle, to the morality of philosophy, rather than to the more advanced, abstract, formal bits of philosophy. So maybe cynicism, and then over time we know that he started to study Stoic physics and logic, the more abstract aspects of the philosophy. And his mother, we're told by Marcus, lived very simply compared to other patricians. Like many aristocrats or wealthy people, it sounds like she actually enjoyed simple things in life. She didn't live a very indulgent, flamboyant lifestyle. Nevertheless, we're told that she thought he went too far in sleeping on the ground and under animal skins, kind of like a Cynic or a Spartan maybe, and that she said, Marcus, really, you need to sleep in a bed like a normal Roman aristocrat. You know, this is like a fad that you're going through or something. You know, it's kind of a bit over the top. But there's some reason to believe that Marcus also, I mean, it's hard to imagine this in a way, and it wouldn't have been that unusual in Roman society, but Marcus dressed down, we're told. When he was traveling, he dressed in Greek style clothing. All this is kind of consistent with Stoicism. You know, I mean, compared to what's hard to imagine maybe is that many Roman, certainly emperors, Caesars, but other wealthy and successful Greek and Romans would wear quite extravagant clothing, you know, red or purple robes, you know, maybe with inlaid with gold thread and things like that. You know, a bit more elaborate sometimes than some of the outfits that we're used to seeing. But he didn't seem to dress like that. Although there is a hint In the Meditations, he says that Rusticus persuaded him not to pose in fancy clothing. So it may be that he went through a phase where he began to, wear fancy clothes and to be a bit more pretentious, and his Stoic tutor talked him out of that and brought him back down to earth.
So we often emphasize positive role models. So in this case, his tutors, his grandfather, his mother. But what do you think was the role that was played in Marcus Aurelius's life a bit later on, in terms of his anti-role models, to which he was also exposed later on? We often think about Hadrian as one of the 5 good emperors, which was sort of the term coined by Machiavelli, I think.
Yeah.
But you give a much more realistic account of what Hadrian's reign really was like, and I think it's quite difficult to count him as one of the good emperors. And I was wondering to what extent being exposed to a man like Hadrian later on gave him this horror imperii and then reluctance to rule, and also something to try to avoid in his life in the future.
Sometimes people will defend Hadrian and say that some of the evidence we have in Roman histories is biased, and it comes from the senatorial class and their political rivals and so on. But there is so much evidence from so many different sources that cast aspersions on Hadrian's character towards the end of his reign in particular, that I think it's difficult to whitewash him. He definitely was, even Fronto in a private letter to Marcus. And Fronto is an interesting witness, because some of the best witnesses in history are the ones that are explicitly compromised. So Fronto apologizes to Marcus for, he says to Marcus that when Hadrian was alive, he used to praise him in many speeches in the Senate. So he was toadying, he was sucking up to the emperor. And now he's backpedaling like crazy and saying, I only did that because I was scared of him and not because I actually loved him, which is a peculiar, but it seems like quite a revealing thing to say. We have no reason to doubt Fronto when he admits that he was lying in the past, and he compares, of all people, he compares Hadrian to Hades, like the lord of the underworld, the tyrant who rules over the underworld, which is a remarkable image. He compares Marcus's mother, incidentally, to the goddess Athena, like the goddess of wisdom, the goddess of Athens, which definitely resonates. She seems to have been a woman who was really known for being immersed in Greek culture, but Hadrian he compares to Hades peculiarly. And I agree. I think Hadrian really shaped Marcus's life far more than people normally assume, and as a negative role model, as somebody that Marcus wanted to avoid becoming. I think Marcus, in his mind, when he says you must avoid becoming Caesarified, don't let your mind be dyed purple and corrupted by imperial power, I very much think he has Hadrian in mind. Marcus is someone who's driven by a desire not to become Hadrian. And was Hadrian a good emperor? In certain regards, Hadrian was a good emperor. He was extremely conscientious in organizing the army and other aspects of Roman society. But Hadrian was better when he was away from home. Maybe there's a reason for that. When he returned to Rome, he degenerated catastrophically into really quite a sinister figure. Hadrian had an extensive network of spies and paid informers. He engaged in a number of political purges, including against members of Marcus's family. So I really think Marcus probably saw Hadrian as quite a terrifying figure. And also Hadrian, to add to that, was kind of a physically quite, I think, a disturbing and in person, not just in terms of his physical appearance. He had we're told he had a horrible skin disease, that his limbs were bloated and swollen. He was suicidal towards the end, kind of raving. He lived in this huge villa complex that he constructed. I mean, it would have been, Marcus had to go and live there when he was 15. It's hard to even imagine what that would have been like. You know, it would have been like walking into another planet, with this tyrant in a way who engaged in political purges, having people executed around him, paranoid. He must have been almost like a larger than life, I think it would be an understatement, character. Of course, he had a huge impact on Marcus, and Marcus doesn't mention him in book one of the Meditations, which is very significant. He has nothing positive to say about him at that point.
And I think also the fact that that he had close relationships with other young men or boys, including Antoninus. I wonder whether that also played into him being a bit more reluctant to spend time with him. Or
well, I'll do a quick list of people that Marcus doesn't mention. So we can, if you're a biographer, again, you often have to read between the lines. You look for what's unsaid. The surprising absence of things, and that's in Roman society. To not mention someone or to only mention them briefly was far more explicit snub than it is in our own society today. Romans are very sensitive to that. So certainly not mentioning Hadrian is quite remarkable in book one. He also doesn't mention Herodes Atticus, who is a family friend, a very prominent, very wealthy billionaire Greek, the leading sophist of the time. Marcus's Greek rhetoric tutor for many years, doesn't mention him. The most famous intellectual in the world at that point. And Marcus doesn't mention having learned anything from him of value. He obviously doesn't mention Seneca at any point in the Meditations, although we know that he had read Seneca, because Fronto mentions that he'd been reading him. So absolutely, but the other person that more obscure in a sense, that Marcus doesn't mention anywhere, and we might not expect him to mention him, but it's still interesting. He never mentions Antoninus anywhere. And also the historians that talk about Marcus never mention Antoninus. So for that reason, I think when people talk about Marcus and they write about him, they've often forgotten Antoninus. And what I try to do when I write his biography is to avoid the trap of a kind of tunnel vision where we just research Marcus's life. So I think, no, Marcus grew up under Hadrian. He went for a time to live in Hadrian's villa. So we would want to research Hadrian's life. And we'd want to research what we know about Roman society in general, so that we have the context that Marcus is living in. Well, Antoninus is a massive part of that context, and yet there's no reference to it. He was a young lover. I'm a bit hesitant to even use that term, because he was possibly could be seen as a young boy that was sexually exploited by Hadrian. He died under notoriously peculiar circumstances. He turned up when he was about 19, drowned in the River Nile while he was on a barge trip with Hadrian. And shortly after that, Hadrian returned to Rome, and Marcus became one of his favorites. And at 15, Marcus had to go and live in Hadrian's villa, which we know was full of busts of Antoninus everywhere. So another weird thing about this is Marcus as a child has to go and live in this place where he's walking around surrounded by statues everywhere of the Hadrian's former boy lover who died under mysterious circumstances. I mean, everything about this is so strange. For a 15-year-old boy, it's creepy. It's very creepy and very odd. And Hadrian created a huge religious cult. He forced a religious cult on Roman society based around the worship of Antoninus. And so, that must have been such a strange, surreal experience. And say we also don't know for sure. There's no reference to Marcus ever meeting Antoninus, but it seems really unlikely that they wouldn't have met. because they were both part of Hadrian's circle. They were favorites of Hadrian. And Antoninus was slightly older than Marcus. He spent time at Rome. So it seems almost inevitable that Marcus must have met this youth. He was like a celebrity, you know, because of his looks and his charisma and the importance that Hadrian placed on him. And obviously this shapes the public perception of Hadrian. But now when Hadrian appoints somebody as his successor, or he brings somebody into his circle as a favorite, it's in the shadow of Antoninus, in a sense. And so the Romans, to some extent, would see Lucius Cionius Commodus, the first man that Marcus, that Hadrian wanted to appoint as his successor, is, you know, being another young man that Hadrian was maybe in love with, like Antoninus. And then he became ill. He died prematurely, but he had a son who we know as Lucius Verus. I think he was about 5 or 6 or something at the time, if I remember rightly. Like, so we now have this. I think most Romans thought Hadrian had created this mess. Like, we use this phrase in English, a dog's breakfast. The succession under Hadrian had become a complete dog's breakfast, a shambles, because he adopted this guy who died and yet had a son. And so this man's son would seem like he's now in line for the throne. But instead, Hadrian bypasses him and appoints Antoninus Pius as his successor. And I think this leaves Marcus with a problem that he then resolves later by making Lucius Verus his co-emperor. Because the Romans would have said, but this guy was in line, you know, and he got, you know, he got bypassed. So Marcus makes his this boy who became his adoptive brother, his co-emperor. And that's another thing that really shapes Marcus's life, having gone from this negative role model of Hadrian, this tyrannical figure in many ways. Marcus is now lumbered with a co-emperor and a brother who the histories portray as an alcoholic and a kind of playboy and a very irresponsible ruler. The opposite of although he was educated in Stoicism, he seems to have completely, you know, looks like he didn't care less for those lessons, and he became everything that Stoicism warns us against, in a sense.
So how was that in comparison when he finally was able to be with his adoptive father, who was so much different to Hadrian? I think you mentioned that in those 23 years where they were together, I mean, I think they only spent two days apart. So it seemed like a very, very close relationship that they had.
The Romans saw them as being like like very closely associated. And in fact, here's like a little bit of trivia. So in Latin, there isn't really a word that corresponds perfectly with the English word emperor. You know, there are really a number of times. It's a complicated story about how the office of emperor evolved from the time of Augustus. It's kind of, you know, made of a number of compromises and fudges, and they manufactured this position out of the Roman Republic, and it evolved over time. But what we call the Roman emperor really is a mixture of different titles and powers, and some of them, what's confusing for us, but not so much the Romans, is that some of these titles and powers could be held by more than one person, and some of them could be held at different times. And so we say that Marcus became emperor in 161 CE. He succeeded Antoninus Pius after he died. So Marcus absolutely idolized his adoptive father. He's the opposite of Hadrian in his eyes. Marcus sees him as exemplifying the Stoic virtues. Now, we don't believe that Antoninus Pius was a Stoic, although, you know, if we really want to do a deep dive into the history, it's not impossible that Antoninus was influenced by Stoicism. It seems likely that Antoninus would have had Stoic advisors at court. And Marcus said he viewed philosophers with a great deal of respect. So he's maybe pretty close to being a Stoic in some regards. He seems like a guy maybe who knew Stoics, respected them, consulted with them, but stopped short of actually becoming a Stoic himself officially, as it were. So I don't think there's a clear-cut line here. You know, I think there's some overlap between the Stoicism, the influence of Stoicism and Antoninus, and then Marcus just taking that, you know, a few degrees further. But what I was going to say was that 13 years before Marcus became Augustus, or emperor, as we phrase it today, Antoninus gave him most of the imperial powers. He gave him the title imperator, or supreme commander of the military. He gave him the tribunician power in the Senate. So really the main political power of the emperor, his ability to veto Senate motions. He had been married to Faustina the Younger, who was an Augusta, because her mother, the empress, had passed away, and so Antoninus gave the title Augusta to his daughter. So Marcus was married to something resembling an empress, had these imperial titles and powers, and had the title Caesar, of course, 13 years before. So although we say it was Marcus for the first time who appointed a co-emperor, Antoninus Pius had almost done that with Marcus. And so we could also say, rather than thinking there's a kind of clear dividing line, we might think that the reign of Antoninus Pius and the reign of Marcus Aurelius kind of overlap to some extent. And we can maybe view some of the political decisions that were made and policies in Antoninus's reign is reflecting also Marcus's agenda and values, incidentally. But Antoninus, there's, I think, somewhere we have a reference, there's probably in the Meditations that Marcus refers to himself as a disciple. Yes, he calls himself a disciple of Antoninus. And I really believe that's quite significant. The amount, Romans would have seen the sheer number of words that he uses to describe Antoninus as reflecting the importance that he places on him. And second only to him, Lucius Verus, he mentions only fleetingly. He damns him with faint praise in book 1 of the Meditations. But Antoninus, clearly, he has so much to say about this man's virtues. It's a reflection of the importance that he places on him. And then who comes second? Well, second to Antoninus in terms of the number of the word count, with Marcus's praise of him, would be Junius Rusticus, his Stoic mentor. So I think it's fair to say that these two men had the biggest influence on Marcus's character as an emperor, certainly.
I think it was Rusticus who introduced him to Epictetus. So I think that was probably a bit of competition between Fronto and Rusticus on who's going to have a bigger impact on Marcus Aurelius.
That's definitely something that really emerges in the letters. We have this private cache of letters between Fronto and Marcus, and also between Fronto and some other people. And it really seems clear that Marcus was quite devoted to Fronto, but that gradually there's a rivalry between the study of rhetoric and the study of Stoicism. He feels that there's a kind of existential crisis almost that he undergoes, that Marcus undergoes. And Fronto feels quite kind of competitive about being, obviously in Roman society, we can imagine that the most beloved mentor and tutor of the emperor is a very powerful man. And there's a considerable amount of kind of social prestige that goes along with that. So it's not surprising that Fronto feels like there's a kind of personal struggle going on. He feels kind of threatened by Rusticus becoming Marcus's favorite tutor. And this seems like it's harder for us in some ways to imagine what this signifies, but for Marcus, it really does seem like he's making a decision almost like a religious conversion from rhetoric to Stoicism. And although he began studying, a peculiarity about this is, although we're told he began studying philosophy very young, at age 12, he doesn't finalize this conversion until he's in his mid-20s, much later. So he spent a long time kind of not toying with Stoicism, but studying Stoicism without really fully committing to viewing himself as a Stoic, I think. And then at some point in his 20s, something shifts, and he seems to now view himself as more explicitly identifying with Stoicism.
So that was his philosophical leanings, but what about his spirituality, which is, I suppose, somewhat connected, but also somewhat separate? You mentioned his devotion to Aletheia, the primordial goddess of truth, which is probably more of a moral than religious stance. But at the same time, as the emperor, he was Pontifex Maximus, so
Yeah.
so he fulfilled some of those prophecies, sacrificing lions, even though he probably didn't fully believe in that, but still felt like he was duty bound to fulfill some of that. But at the same time, he was also paying a lot of attention to his dreams, to the dreams of his wife, and at some point, I think he even went somewhat against the advice of Epictetus, who said that we should wish for things to happen the way they do by praying to gods to save his soldiers, which led to the lightning miracle, which I suppose might have further strengthened his spiritual beliefs. So, what was that balance between rationality and philosophy and spirituality in his case?
I think this is a tension in a way that runs all the way through ancient philosophy and definitely Stoicism. Marcus is a product of his time in many ways, and he's the Pontifex Maximus. He's the Pope of the Roman religion, something that people, often forget or overlook. And some emperors undoubtedly took that role with a pinch of salt. But Marcus seems to be to take it. He's very interested in religion. He's very interested in the rituals of religion, symbolism. Also, another bit of trivia: the Marcus's family were reputedly descended from Numa, the king, the Roman king, the second king of Rome, a kind of semi-legendary figure who is supposed to have founded the rites of the Roman religion, or many of them anyway. So Marcus's family had this traditional association with these rites that he was now in charge of as the supreme priest of the state religion at the time. And yeah, definitely he would have, I'm sure he had a huge amount of responsibility that he felt it was important to his role to be seen to be conducting these public rituals, because it's what the Roman people expected. I'm sure he felt that they played a really important social role. The Roman religion, like many ancient religions, it's often said that it was more of an exterior matter of observing rituals, performing chants and prayers, and there's less emphasis on the internal experience of faith. That's more of something that becomes more of a feature of religion with Christianity. The inner significance of religion comes to the fore. So for Marcus, some of these rituals are subject to multiple interpretations. The Stoics traditionally interpret ancient mythology and symbolism as metaphors for different aspects of nature. So they can accept the myths and the symbolism and try and interpret in a way that fits in with their metaphysics, their pantheism, basically, like their theology. And I suspect that's what Marcus did. Also, the Stoics are rationalists in the sense that because they embrace philosophy and reason, there's a strain in cynicism and stoicism that's cynical about the supernatural and about magic and sorcery and things like that. So there's a tension in Marcus between having to observe these rituals, but at the same time being trained to be kind of skeptical about supernatural ideas. although he probably did believe in dream interpretation, divination, and things that today we would consider superstitious. So what's superstitious to a Roman is, probably different from what we would consider superstitious. But this is undoubtedly something that was at the forefront of his mind. How can I be the high priest of the Roman religion and carry out these prayers and rituals, but do it from a very rational and objective perspective?
And he was quite skeptical, but at the same time rather tolerant, because I think Tertullian and Irenaeus, they mentioned Marcus Aurelius in a very positive light. There's also, I think Marcus Aurelius was somewhat probably, he wasn't particularly impressed with some of the Christian reactions, such as Justin the Martyr. And I think this sort of this description of him being the martyr is probably not really the full story of what happened. And I think that might be why people often have this distorted perception of Marcus Aurelius, who was really tolerant to the point of even allowing, the puppet snake, the Glaucon, who sort of who led to quite a lot of troubles later on. So what was that story?
Well, definitely the way that Marcus, so one of the questions that people often raise today is, did Marcus Aurelius persecute Christians? And there are reasons why people believe that, but it's a hot potato. It's a very controversial subject. So part of the problem here is that some of the Christian sources are part of the Christian tradition, like part of church history, like Eusebius. But from a non-Christian perspective, they appear extremely unreliable. There are numerous problems with our main text that people use as evidence of large-scale Christian persecutions during Marcus's reign. Not the only piece of evidence that people appeal to is this letter about the so-called persecution at Lyon. And it's, long story short, it's so problematic. It's not even clear that it refers to Marcus or to his reign. There are many mistakes in that part of Eusebius. He keeps mixing Marcus up with Antoninus Pius, if I remember rightly. So there's no date attached to it. There's a lot of problems with the text, and also kind of fantastical elements, like the Christians survive inside the stomachs of the lions, or they levitate into the sky and hover above them and things like that. So if you don't believe in miracles, then you're probably going to look at things like that and say, okay, some of this can't be true. So is the rest of it true? The rest of it is highly problematic. So that should make us question it. But the other famous example you mentioned would be Justin Martyr. Now, first thing about that is Justin and I think 6 of his followers were executed at Rome. So it's not wide-scale persecution of Christians. It's a notable but small group of people. Justin came from Syria, if I remember rightly, to Rome, knowing that he would probably face execution for refusing to pledge allegiance to the emperor, which the Roman state would have seen as kind of disloyalty and associated with the threat of insurrection. So it's kind of a big deal. They would have thought this guy's a potential terrorist. And he's come here. We didn't invite him. He's come from Syria. Now he's refusing pointedly. One way of interpreting our record of that case is that, which Marcus didn't try, but Junius Rusticus tried actually, as the prefect, or the kind of mayor of Rome, is that Justin appears to say that he wants to be martyred for some reason. And then in the Meditations, one of the few possible references to Christianity, we have Marcus saying, look, you shouldn't kind of make a show of, it shouldn't be a kind of ego trip to martyr yourself. And then he seems to associate this with Christianity. Now, scholars are not sure if that passage might be an interpolation that someone has added that phrase. There's some issue with the grammar, I believe, that makes them suspect, as with many ancient texts, that it had been tweaked by a later editor. So the jury's out about how authentic that is, if Marcus really said that. But if he did, it does seem like he might be referring to Justin Martyr and the idea that he was he wanted to be killed to make a kind of political, to martyr himself and make a kind of political statement out of it. Maybe that he even traveled to Rome with that intention of causing a kind of staging a scene. But generally, the histories portray Marcus as being extremely tolerant of religions. And then we do have this issue of a number of the Christian sources say that Marcus was a protector or a friend of Christians. So the Christian sources themselves are quite contradictory about this. And he's painted as someone who's extremely tolerant of different religious sects or cults, which is how he would have perceived Christianity as a kind of minority. Also, the Christians in Marcus's time were probably very different from what we think of as Christians today. Most of the Christians in Rome followed a sect which is long extinct. I believe it's called Montanism, and they were particularly into speaking in tongues. So in some ways, maybe a little bit like Pentecostal Christianity today, not quite a kind of mainstream image of Catholicism, perhaps, that comes to our mind. So certainly Marcus's impression of Christians would be this is a kind of small, obscure religious sect. It's a kind of spin-off of Judaism or something. It's problematic because they refuse to pledge loyalty to the emperor. And that's associated in the Roman mind with, like I say, the risk of insurrection or terrorism.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions from the attendees. And Stoic Dan from Orlando asks, you've mentioned Marcus changing his views in his 20s, but what about later in his 40s? Did he struggle while comparing his actions as emperor and his Stoic beliefs?
Well, hello to Stoic Dan and the Orlando Stoics. I'm not sure that do we have any explicit indication that Marcus changed his views later? I don't recall that we have anything that directly indicates that. But there's a couple of things that maybe we could infer. We can make some educated guesses. Why did Marcus start writing the Meditations? Well, it's possible he was already writing notes like this. However, it's also possible that Marcus' life changed dramatically around the time that we believe he began writing the Meditations. He had just left Rome for the first time. Around about this time, Junius Rusticus died. So I think it's reasonable to speculate that I don't know if this is a change in Marcus's values or his interpretation, but maybe more in the way that he utilized Stoicism. I think Marcus, round about this time, 169, 107 to 171 roughly AD, he was very isolated, I think, from his Stoic friends and mentors. And I think he probably felt that he had to become more autonomous and more independent, that he was having to become his own teacher, his own mentor in a way, and perhaps saw writing the Meditations as a way of doing that, not leaning as much on mentors, but learning to take more responsibility for his own self-improvement. I think it's possible to interpret what we see happening as an example of someone finding techniques that allow him to take more responsibility for his own self-improvement.
Thank you. We have another question from Colm Hogan. He asks, I've always enjoyed the quote about no man enters the same river twice. I know Stoicism has changed for me, and rereading something like Meditations can be a completely different experience depending on where you are in life. How has Stoicism changed for you over the years, and in what ways?
Gosh, well, first of all, Marcus's two favorite, it's often said that Marcus's favorite philosopher is Epictetus. That seems pretty clear, but he has a second favorite philosopher, and that appears to be Heraclitus. And there's even a passage where he kind of joins them together. So he seems to be indicating these are his two biggest influences. Incidentally, Justin Martyr, in one of his letters, appears to refer to Heraclitus as a Stoic, which is odd. So obviously he's a pre-Socratic philosopher. He couldn't literally be a Stoic, but it may be that the Stoics in general were so interested in Heraclitus, he was viewed as a kind of de facto Stoic, or as one of the main precursors of Stoicism, and these two traditions were wedded together in the minds of certain individuals. So you can't step into the same river twice. How has Stoicism changed for me? Of course, it changes in a sense every time I read the Meditations. Every time I think about it, my perspective on it, it's kind of evolving a bit. I think it's hard for me to answer this question, but in a sense, like all difficult questions, maybe in a sense there is an easy answer, which is that when I was a young guy, I began studying Stoicism about 25 years ago, when I was, just graduated from Aberdeen University studying philosophy. And I think initially I saw Stoicism, as many people do, as consisting of a bunch of psychological techniques that are strategies for emotional resilience and stuff like that. That's probably the main thing that appealed to me about it. And it took a while for me to realize that the psychological techniques in Stoicism really center on one or two basic concepts that are much more fundamental, more important than the rest of it. I think the idea of cognitive distancing is really the core of what the Stoics have to say about emotional resilience and so on. The idea that it's not events that upset us, but rather our opinions about them. So they have many other techniques. In my first book in Stoicism, I listed 18 different psychological strategies that I can find in Stoicism. But I think this idea about the nature of emotion is really the foundation of everything else in that regard. But even more fundamental is their ethic. And over time, I guess this is true in the past as well. People are drawn to philosophies like Stoicism because of the promise of peace of mind, or as we say today, emotional resilience. But as they get deeper into the subject, they realize it's more about a radically different set of moral values, a different moral worldview, which the Cynics and the Stoics understood as well. Hierocles, one of our other sources for Stoicism, his work on the existent fragments, uses the word epistrophe to describe becoming interested in Stoicism, which is the Greek word for conversion. It means turning around, doing like a U-turn. So that's how radical. They compare embracing Stoicism to a kind of religious conversion or a complete U-turn in our values. So whereas we're born into a society where the majority of people seem to value wealth and reputation, and that our life seems to kind of really be oriented around acquiring property and social status, the Stoics want to say that these things are of no real intrinsic value at all. At most, they're preferred indifference, or they're kind of external advantages, But just to highlight how they lack intrinsic value, wealth in the hands of an evil dictator would be a bad thing, and status in the hands of an evil dictator would be a bad thing. Like, they simply, in a sense, give us more influence and more control over our environment. Whether that's good or bad depends on our character, and whether we are good or bad, wise or vicious. So this moral outlook in Stoicism became more important to me, and also everything that they have to say about the therapy of the psyche and emotional resilience really depends on that. As a therapist, the first thing that really struck me is I specialize in treating social anxiety. And so there are behavioral techniques we use to help people with social anxiety. We get them to change the way they focus their attention. We might get them to interrupt cycles of worrying. They may have beliefs that other people view them negatively. We call that fear of negative evaluation in the research literature. As someone might think, everybody thinks I'm an idiot. They all think I'm a phony, and we might get them to challenge those beliefs, to examine the evidence for them, whether they're exaggerated and so on and so forth. But the point that the Stoics are making is none of this anxiety would exist in the first place if you didn't care what other people think of you that much. It has to do with your values. You know, more fundamentally, all of this therapy would become kind of obsolete if you simply didn't place that much importance on other people's opinions of you, which becomes, as you dig deeper and deeper and deeper, it becomes a moral question. You know, what is most important to you in life? Is it more important to you that you say what you believe in, or is it more important to you that other people like you or approve of what you're saying? You know, and if what dominates is other people's opinions, you're never going to know exactly what they are because you can't read their minds, and you don't have complete control over it. So you really set it, it's what I call a recipe for neurosis, to place, you know, so much importance on other people's opinions of you. That doesn't mean that we should place no importance on it. The Stoics would think that's crazy. You know, they think, of course, in some situations, if you're applying for a job and you want to get the job, then you need to make a good impression with the people interviewing you. But it's not a life or death matter. It doesn't determine the meaning of your entire life. We shouldn't put that much value on it. And so really, as a young guy, particularly, first of all, initially looking at social anxiety, I thought the Stoics are definitely talking about something more fundamental. And so over time, I went from seeing Stoicism as consisting of these strategies and techniques for managing our emotions to teaching something that not only was different, but that was actually even more fundamental in relation to the therapy. Like, the therapy seems superficial once we understand the psychological consequences of embracing Stoic ethic. That's how my perspective has shifted over the years.
Thank you. I think we probably have time for just one more question. So that's a Scottish themed question from James Harley. Did you celebrate Burns Day, and do you think he was a Stoic?
I've got to admit, I forgot this year. Like, usually I do celebrate Burns Night, but so I feel bad about that. Like, but I don't. We celebrate Burns every day. I'll celebrate Burns tonight. Actually, I think it was my wife, who's American, who reminded me that I'd forgotten to celebrate Burns Night. Was Burns a Stoic? Well, I don't know. I don't think Burns would have thought of himself as a Stoic. However, was Burns influenced by Stoicism? I'm not sure there's any evidence that Burns had read the Stoics, but I do believe that Burns shows signs of being influenced by Stoic ideas in a slightly roundabout or indirect way. I believe that Burns probably had read Latin poetry, which contains many Stoic influences. For example, he probably read Horace, and Horace had studied Stoicism and refers to Stoicism in his odes. But he also had studied Epicureanism. So what you often get from the poets is really a kind of eclectic mix of Stoic and Epicurean and other ideas. And I think that had filtered down. So Burns says, even in Tam O'Shanter, pleasures are like poppies spread. You seize the flower, its bloom is shed, or like the snow falls in the river, a moment white, then melts forever. So this is a literary trope. It refers to the impermanence of material things. You might read that and think, gee, is Robert Burns a Buddhist or something? He believes in the impermanence of material things. But, you know, of course, he got this from the Stoics and Heracliteans and, you know, but probably filtered down second or third hand via his reading of poetry. So it's in there. Right, but I don't think he would have necessarily thought of himself as a Stoic. That said, as we were saying earlier, he was friends with a Stoic, an avowed Stoic called Professor of Philosophy at Glasgow University called Dougald Stewart. During the Enlightenment period, was one of the leading advocates, along with Adam Smith, of Stoicism, of Stoic ethics in particular. And Dougald Stewart wrote about Stoicism in actually a far more insightful way than many modern academics. He had a very sympathetic reading of Stoicism, very modern in a way. I'd like to think that Burns sat down and had conversations with his friend Dougald Stewart about Stoic philosophy. You know, Dougald Stewart would have read Burns's poems, like Contented with Little, for example, and many other passages in Burns, and thought, this is similar to the philosophy that I'm interested in. So I guess we may never know, unless it's tucked away in his surviving writing somewhere. But it's tantalizing. But certainly Burns knew people who were into Stoicism, and certainly we can find echoes or traces of similar ideas in his writings. I think that is one of the things that initially inspired me. You know, when I began reading the Stoics, I read Marcus Aurelius, and he was talking about the impermanence of material things. And I didn't think this sounds like Buddhism. I thought it sounds like Rabbi Burns. In a way, that's kind of what it reminds me of. And, you know, being contented with the simple things in life, the Stoic idea. I thought this seems to me to be familiar from reading Rabbi Burns at school. So I like to believe that there's an element of Stoicism in the Scottish psyche. It's more part of our culture than we realise. Certainly, I think Scottish people are more Stoic than the English. You know, I could be wrong about that. But the influence of Adam Smith and Dougald Stewart and there were many other Enlightenment figures that were explicitly influenced by Stoicism. It's like we were saying earlier, it's been forgotten. And it's a shame it's not more widely known. But Scottish people should be into Stoicism. You know, there's a deja vu quality to it because it permeates our culture.
Well, thank you very much. It was a fascinating discussion. So again, please do pre-order the book on Amazon. It's a great book.
I have a copy here.
Oh yes,
my publisher will be happy if
yes, Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic Emperor by Donald Robertson. And if you live in Scotland, you're welcome to attend our monthly meeting tomorrow at 7 p.m. in Edinburgh at Monboddo. And our topic will be gratitude. And if you have any parting thoughts or wisdom to impart on your Scottish Stoic brethren, please let us know. And thank you again.
Well, thank you. I think gratitude is a fantastic topic. It's massively underestimated. The Stoics believed it was a virtue, but it's in modern discussions of Stoicism, it's seldom mentioned. Marcus says occasionally these ancient authors say things that really seem very psychologically astute to me. Maybe not to other people, but, you know, I read so many books about psychology and psychotherapy, and often I just see the same ideas rehashed over and over again. But occasionally in an ancient text, I'll see something I'll think, that's a very insightful observation. Marcus says that most people imagine the presence of things that are absent, and that leads them to crave things that they don't have. So I think, oh, it would be amazing if I had a Ferrari. How cool would that be? But I don't. Yeah, but what if I did? And that encourages craving for things that we don't have. It encourages a kind of psychological pain. And he says we should make an effort to do a U-turn and do the opposite by imagining the absence of things that we do have. And when we do that, what we experience is gratitude. So I look outside just now, and the snow is thick in Quebec and Montreal outside. There's icicles. We had some pretty heavy blizzards. You know, I'm very grateful. I have a roof over my head and heating, you know, and double glazing and things like that. And I really, you know, a Stoic practice would be just to contemplate all of the things that we take for granted and imagine what it would be like if we don't have them. And Marcus rightly thinks that this is just a far healthier habit to get into. But the way he phrases it is very interesting. Rather than imagining the presence of things that are absent, we should make an effort to do the opposite and imagine the absence of things that are present. It's a nice rhetorical, paradoxical way of framing it, a nice contrast, but a very astute psychological observation. And very relevant today. There's a lot of research interest in the positive psychology field today and the psychological benefits of gratitude. Again and again and again, modern research in psychology seems to lend support to things that the ancient Stoics had agreed on based on their personal experience and intuition. So the Stoics were proven right once again.
As always.
I hope that you, as always, I hope that you can have a good discussion about gratitude. I think it's a very, very good topic to focus on.
Thank you again. Thank you very much. We very much enjoyed it. Thank you, and have a good day, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.